What are the causes of violence, and is it possible to completely separate self-state violence from interstate violence?
So the first thing I'd like to say is violence is a function of human nature and human behavior. What I like to think about is the human condition. And if you think about it in that way, it makes it easy to break down lines between states and non-state actors and sub-state violence and drug cartel violence and terrorist violence. I think these are all institutions which capture, constrain, and impact human behavior. But it really stems from fundamental human nature. And I think really we have to start with what does it mean to be human? And then talk about violence in that context. The alternative is we talk about states as if they're actors. And I absolutely reject that idea. I don't think that the United States is an actor and Mexico is an actor and Russia is an actor and Ukraine is an actor. I think Vladimir Putin's an actor, but not Russia, right? Because this is about human nature and human behavior. And that's the basis of analysis that an economist would take in anything. And especially for me as an economist in the national security field, I think of humans as actors and states just being constructs around human behavior, which enable and constrain our behavior.
Thinking of the economic choice of violence, what is the role of kinship and firms?
So again, I'm just going to go way back to first principles here, that to survive and thrive, we need each other. And there are there are many ways in which humans affiliate. And one form of affiliation is kinship. And as in actual blood relatives. But there are other forms. There's nationalism is a form of kinship. If we have a shared passion for a basketball team, that could be a kinship. There are all sorts of ways in which humans develop these kinships. So this is, as you know, the affiliative instinct that is just a core part of human nature. So this is important to us because it's correlated with survival and success. It's correlated with self-preservation and propagation of the species, Adam Smith. And so if I'm running, I run two companies in the United States, and we often in the corporate world will talk about, we'll use kinship type language. We'll talk about the family. We'll talk about supporting each other the way siblings would support each other. If you look at drug cartels, they use very much the language of family. Why is that, right? Why the us versus them to the extent of using the actual language of kinship? It's because you need to deter defection. So if you're running a software company like I am, if you're running a pizza parlor, or if you're running a drug cartel, you want to deter defection. And one way to deter defection is to create these really, as close as you can, human bonds. So that increases the cost of defection. And so it turns out that illicit organizations are often very family focused and family oriented in their behavior and in their language, because defections for illegal organizations or illicit organizations are very costly. So it's a very important part of it as you look at the world of violence and coercion. The ideas of family and kinship are very important in the lexicon and the language used for the purpose of deterring defection and promoting loyalty to the firm. There's an economic reason for that, and that is if you and I are, right, you own a restaurant and I am a food wholesaler and I bring food to your restaurant and you don't pay me for the food I delivered, I can sue you in a court. If, however, you and I are engaged in trafficking drugs of some sort, illicit drugs, we're trafficking cocaine, and I deliver product to you and you don't pay me, well, I can't call police and say, I gave her a kilo of Coke and she didn't pay me. I can't bring you to court. So defection is much more damaging in the illicit market than it is in the licit or legal market. And so it's more important that I create strong bonds to deter defection. And that's why I would use language of family and kinship and brotherhood and sisterhood and love and godfather and all of those terms.
How does kinship facilitate governance in any kind of group?
So what you want to do is you want to, everything's a firm, right? Everything's firms and entrepreneurs. And I take this to an extreme for the purpose of making the point, but everything's a firm, an entrepreneur, and a market. Everything is, right? The Mexican government is a firm. The US government's a firm. There are entrepreneurs who lead different aspects of the government, and they're competing. They're competing for revenue, for taxes, to run their annual budgets, right? So they're firms, entrepreneurs, and marketplaces. So if I'm running a firm, I want to recruit and retain my workforce. And if I can't retain my workforce, I run the defection problem I just described, but it's also just expensive. It's expensive to recruit. So again, I run a software company. I recruit employees. I work very hard to recruit employees, and I need to retain those employees, right? So it's just good business. It has absolutely nothing to do with drugs, weapons, guns. It's just good business. So the ways in which you think about human behavior is about incentives. It's about costs, benefits, expected costs, and that is universal. Again, it's just this idea of fundamental human nature. What I think is interesting is applying this to the real world of national security. So when I think about Vladimir Putin, right, how do these ideas help me understand an individual, an entrepreneur's decision to engage in this massive campaign of violence, which is the Russian military invading Ukraine? Anyways, that's, I think, an interesting case study that's current and relevant in the news if you want to go there next, to think about, well, how do these economic ideas help us to make sense of all of this?
Every ruler, either a head of state or the leader of a violent grouping, must combine repression and loyalty to allow for governance. How do kinship and divisive rhetoric tie into this?
So two ideas. So there's the divisive rhetoric, really, which is going back to this idea of us and them. We divide the world into us and them. It's fundamental human nature. And like I said, it's correlated with survival and success in the world. And this idea of loyalty and repression, again, goes to this idea of why loyalty is good, but there's this thing called the dictator's dilemma, which is that the dictator can't repress everybody. The dictator needs help in repressing, and so therefore the dictator needs loyalty. So if I'm running the cartel, I need some people that I just pay them a lot of money so that they're loyal to me. And then they help me repress everybody else, right? That we can't pay, put on the payroll or whatever. So the two levers, that's an oversimplification, but two levers of staying in power if you're an autocrat or a dictator and you're illegitimate is the application of loyalty and repression. And the difference between you and me is one of us might, prefer more loyalty than repression, and the other one of us might prefer more repression than loyalty. But these are two levers, and both of them cost. Both of them are are goods that I can't have all of everything. I can't have unlimited money and buy off everybody, and I can't beat everybody up and lock everybody up because they are both expensive to do. And so I have to think about some trade-offs given the wealth that I have. And I also have to think about how do I gain more wealth so that I can buy more loyalty and buy more repression so I can increase my power. So again, think about it is entrepreneurs running firms in competitive markets. And that's where these ideas of loyalty, repression, and disparaging comments about the out group and talking about how great we are. Vladimir Putin right now talking about how the Russian soldiers are going into Ukraine to save the Ukrainian people from the Nazi leaders in Ukraine. It's all terrible lies. Not a bit of it is true. It's outrageous, but he's advancing this to try to generate loyalty among the Russian people. And that's why it makes sense for him to say these things, because he needs to try to justify his actions among a Russian population that is largely skeptical and doesn't believe him. So it makes sense. My point is it makes sense. The idea, let me just take a step back because your questions are right on, but I want to frame it a little bit. So I started my career by traveling around the world and seeing war and seeing poverty and seeing repression. And what I concluded was that these terrible things that people do had nothing to do with ethnicity, religion, language, skin color. None of these things mattered. There are these terrible behaviors that take place everywhere. And what bothered me as I became a professional in the national security community and worked for years in Washington, D.C. as a national security professional, is that we tended to bucket criminal activity based upon one of these identity markers, right? We didn't talk about drug traffickers. We talked about Mexican drug traffickers and Colombian drug traffickers, right? We didn't talk about terrorists. We talked about Islamic terrorists, right? That made me so angry for all of these years because I think the identity label confuses our analysis. It doesn't help. Being Mexican or Colombian or a Muslim has absolutely nothing to do with the behavior of drug trafficking and terrorism. So instead of just arguing against identity labels, I had to put new language around it so that people could understand and make it simple again. And so what I'm suggesting is let's get rid of identity labels and let's talk about markets. Let's talk about firms and entrepreneurs and markets. Because that has absolutely nothing to do with what house of worship you go to, what language you speak, what's your nationality or ethnicity or religion. None of that matters. What matters is you are an individual in a firm, in a market, and you are making decisions that you believe is in your best interest. And that's really all that matters. You can describe all of human behavior to include all of the illicit human behavior by using the language of markets and dropping the language of identity. What's helpful is what's the firm, who's the entrepreneur, what's the nature of the market, and how do we get that firm to fail? And how we get the firm to fail has nothing to do with the ethnicity or nationality or religion or skin color. Nothing. If identity labels are wrong, and I think they are, we judge people by behaviors, not the way they look, not where they pray, not what language they speak, but by like a drug trafficker is somebody who traffics drugs, right? That's it. It's the behavior that matters, right? I actually think that the same thing happens in terms of thinking about law enforcement, right? So in the last couple years, there's been this movement against law enforcement because of police brutality, because of George Floyd, because of all of these terrible things that have happened. And I would also suggest that that we have to apply this in kind of a law enforcement context as well. This isn't just drug cartels and national security. This gets down to the most basic street corner level of understanding, jerks are people who behave like jerks, right? Just to use the nicest language I could come up with on the spot there. And we got to think about it that way. So we've always got to get beyond identity labels and look at the way people behave. And if we want to judge them based upon the behavior, regardless of how they look, their skin color, or where they are, any of those types of things. And I think we've got to get much better at that in the national security community, yes. In law enforcement, also, yes. In throughout all of our institutions of government, we have to get better at this.
Assuming human conditions of survival in the face of goal achievement and scarcity, how is the Russia-Ukraine conflict explained?
Vladimir Putin is an entrepreneur running a firm in a competitive market. He has some set of goals. He has an objective function, right? I don't know what his goals are. The first thing I would say is I talk to lots of experts throughout the week, and they all tell me what Vladimir Putin wants. I don't know what he wants. You don't know what he wants. And none of the experts I speak with know what he wants. These are all educated guesses made by very smart people. So the first point is that as an economist, I can tell you is that he has goals. His behavior is not random. That's a really important phrase. I can tell you that his behavior is not random, but I don't know what his ultimate goals are, okay? But he's seeking something, okay? That's the first. And he's taking these actions based upon some expectation of a positive outcome. Just because he has an expectation of a positive outcome doesn't mean he's going to get it, right? Have you ever tried anything in your life where you thought, hey, doing this is a great idea, and then it actually wasn't? The example, when I'm talking to younger students at Georgetown, I'd be like, did you ever go on a date with somebody and realize that was a huge mistake, right? Everybody had that experience, right? So just because you think it's a good idea before you take that action, it might not be. So he thought invading Ukraine with the Russian army was going to be a good idea. For some reason, he thought it was going to be good for him personally. Beyond that, he has public statements. So we can't conflate his public statements with what he wants because people lie, right? I could invade another country. And if I say, well, I'm invading the other country because I'm a self-centered, arrogant jerk, then people aren't going to support me, even if that's the real reason I'm invading. If I invade the country and I say, well, there are people there that are being oppressed and we have to go save them, now I have a chance of developing kinship and generating loyalty and deterring defection. That's what we're observing in the world today. We're seeing Vladimir Putin choose to invade a country for some reason we don't know. And all the words coming out of his mouth are designed to generate loyalty and deter defection among people that he needs to be loyal to him. He needs loyalty and repression. He is out arresting people and he's establishing new sedition laws based upon people that speak publicly about opposing his incursions into Ukraine. That's repression. He is generating loyalty by saying, well, there are Nazis who run Ukraine, even though the leaders of Ukraine are Jewish, which makes no sense that people would believe this, but he's saying there are Nazis running Ukraine and we're going in to save them. And this is we're going to restore the Stalin era borders of Greater Russia, which includes Eastern and Southern Ukraine at a minimum. It also includes the Baltics, right? I mean, there are all kinds of things he's talking about, trying to generate this us versus them mentality, like the great Russia versus the rest of the world. I don't know if he believes any of that, but I know as an economist that he better be saying exactly those things. He has to say those things. So I want to caution everybody to not think you know what he wants just because of what he says. because these are the things he has to say. He hasn't said anything that shocked me. It's all exactly what you would have to say if you were an evil, arrogant jerk that just wanted to invade a country for your own self-interest. You would still say exactly these things, right? His biggest vulnerability, and I wrote about this 2 weeks ago, and it was published in The Hill. His biggest vulnerability is the Russian street, Russian popular opinion. The world is responding collectively in sanctioning Russia in ways that I didn't think was possible, and it's amazing. We're at a high point in the use of sanctions in the history of the world. There are dollars and weapons flowing into Ukraine to help the Ukrainian army defeat the Russian army in Ukraine. Both of those are historic. Neither of those will cause Vladimir Putin to pull out of Ukraine. His only vulnerability is inside of Russia, and it's twofold. The first is the Russian street. 20 million Russians marching in the streets of Moscow opposing Putin is a real threat to Putin. We, the United States, Mexico, the Western Europe, Asia, we should all be uniting, yes, behind the Ukrainian people, but we should also be uniting behind the Russian people who have the courage to take to the street. That's the first and most important threat to Vladimir Putin. It's 20 million people in the streets of Russia protesting him. And then the second and related is one of his oligarchs, one of his generals will put him out of his misery, will take him out. I don't know that that's going to happen, and I don't know that I'm advocating for that, as some folks have said recently. But if I'm talking about his vulnerabilities, if I were him, I'd be scared to death of 20 million Russians protesting, and I'd be scared to death of the people who have access to my home wearing a weapon, because those are the two things that could cause me to lose my job. And I want the world to focus on that while we drape ourselves in the Ukrainian flag and stand with the people of Ukraine. Let's think about his real vulnerability.
This conflict has been explained mostly within the realm of states and how they behave. Yet, states are run by individuals whose decisions have a relevant impact. How would you explain Putin's decision to invade in terms of the constraints he may resolve through this war?
So here's what I'd say that might surprise you. And I'm building on my last comment. I don't know if it's for Putin, if it's greed, power, or grievance, because I don't know that I have to know. I know his behavior. I know his rhetoric. I encourage everybody to dismiss his rhetoric and focus on his behavior. And I'm really interested, and I've been exploring this myself over the last couple of years in my academic work, which is, to what extent do I need to care if it's greed or power? Is Vladimir Putin doing this because he wants more money or because he wants more power? My reaction that I would give you today, Alejandra, that I would not have said maybe 5 or 10 years ago, is I don't care. I don't care if I get it right. If I guess that it's greed and it's really power, or if I guess that it's power and it's really greed, I don't know that it matters. I think I should be countering him based upon what I just said. I want to counter him based upon he's doing things that are bad and I don't like them. And his vulnerability, I believe right now, is the Russian street. And so I'm going to take behavior based upon that. So that's my first response, which you haven't heard me say anything like that in the past. But I think that's where I am right now, which is not only should I not care about outward appearance, but I'm starting to think that the actual motivation is interesting to me, but I don't know that it's dispositive of what I should do. Okay, and I'm open to to you and the members of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations to reach out to me and tell me why I'm wrong, because I'm not sure I'm right. I just think it's an interesting hypothesis to argue I don't really need to care about the motivation. right? So let me just stop that there and invite some debate from you and your colleagues. I would love it. Second thing is this idea that the foreign policy community, many people listening to our conversation, will think that yes, this is the rightful sphere of Russia and the Russian nation, and that's why Putin is doing this. Here's what I want to challenge you on, and I imagine the majority of people listening to this believe that, and I don't believe that. And here's how I would challenge everybody to think about it, and that is, think about it in terms of a causal direction. Is Putin invading Ukraine because there is a natural sphere of Russian influence that he needs to get back for the Russian people, which would be his talking point also? Or the fact that there's this narrative of a natural sphere of Russian influence allowing him to go out and invade neighboring countries? So I'm changing the direction of the causal error. He's not invading Ukraine because it's the natural thing for Russia to do, but because people say there's a natural thing for Russia to do, he's like, great, I get to go friggin' invade this country. And that's what I believe. I believe the causal error goes in the other direction. He's capitalizing on this narrative to justify his illegal and atrocious use of power. And we shouldn't play into that narrative for that reason.
On the issue of narrative, what can be done to avoid the younger generation living through this, both Ukrainian and Russian youths, to eschew the formation of hate-based kinships and firms that perpetuate the very dangerous othering?
There's no way to answer that in a short amount of time, but I think we have some examples from the past. So there have been conflicts in the past, and there have been reconciliations afterwards. So these, truth and reconciliation ideas are something that social scientists have thought about in the past. So there's two competing ideas here. The first is, as I said at the top of our conversation, identity is a good thing in the sense, these identity labels tend to be good in the sense that they allow us to survive and propagate over time. And that's probably why we have them. That's probably why there are these identity labels, such as a nationality, because the nationality allows me to know that in a conflict, I know where my people are, and I know where not my people are. And if I know that, I'm likely to survive. The example that you and I have talked about in the past is a prison. So when you walk into a prison, and you don't know anybody and they don't know you, you walk to the people who look like you, because that's where safety is. You have to have a gang. If you don't have a gang in a prison, you are not gonna do well. You have to have a gang. And gangs are defined by outward appearance, right? So in a most basic primitive, and I think that prison is like a primitive population, a primitive society. It's all based upon outward appearance. So there's to some extent, Ukrainian children are going to learn to distrust Russian children, which is the point you're making. And they're all going to grow up with this level of distrust because I'm Ukrainian and you're Russian and things like that. But I think, and I would end on a high note, which is I think that the younger generations now that will be leading the world here soon, there is much more of this understanding of shared humanity. And I think this idea of shared humanity is how you overcome something like that. So us versus them is never going to go away. We're humans. The human condition is hardwired into an us versus them. But I think there's more empathy in this idea of we're all human. And we're moving beyond what I would call racism. And racism in the sense that we label somebody as other so that way we can treat them as something less than human. And I really believe that younger generations are doing a better job than than my generation and my parents and grandparents' generations at understanding that identifying another human as other, or othering is your word, is wrong. Because the reason you other is so that way you can treat them less good. And I think there's a growing appreciation and understanding that that's not appropriate. And I think there's more of an appreciation of that today than there was 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 60 years ago. So I really would, I believe that. I believe that to be true. I realize it sounds hopelessly optimistic, but I think we're moving in the right direction. The world is much less violent today than it was 20, 40, 60 years ago. And I think this idea of treating people as humans and not as other than humans is the historical trend is moving in the right direction. And I think that bodes well for the future of Russia, Ukraine, and other conflicts in the world.
What alternatives can help or coerce the substitution of kinetic efforts?
I think narrative is powerful. I think narrative is the weapon of choice today, in the sense that I think we need to move beyond kinetic, missiles, guns, and we need to tell stories better. The internet era allows us to tell stories better, and social media and Twitter, and as you just said, allows us to tell stories better. And what I would do is I would weaponize, and I don't mean that in a coercive way. I mean that in a positive way. We should weaponize storytelling about Russian people standing up to Putin. We should lionize people who do that. We should acknowledge them as the heroes that they really are. And I think the world should do that. I think you and I as individuals should do that. And if you know a Russian person who has the courage to state their opposition to Putin's invasion. And notice in our talk, I'm following the protocol that many others are, and not calling it a Russian invasion, but Putin's invasion, right? Think about just how powerful that is, right? The Putin invasion of Ukraine. And if we know Russians, because everybody, like, it's in this world, we all have friends who are Russian or from Russia. Make sure that we stand with them and say, look, we know that this isn't you invading Ukraine, this is Putin invading Ukraine. And to the extent that they have the ability to publicly oppose Putin, we should treat them as heroes, because he is evil and he will try to find retribution against people who speak out against him. And those Russians who do speak out against him, especially those Russians in Russia, we need to stand with them, and we need to tell stories. I would love to pick up the newspaper tomorrow, and for the big national papers around the world, in Washington, D.C., in Mexico City, everywhere, to like have a front page above the fold story about some Russian heroes who are opposing Putin. That's what we need to do. That's the best weapon, I think, right now for us. It has nothing to do with cruise missiles or bombs. It's the front page of international newspapers and social media praising the Ukrainians, yes, and the Russians who oppose Putin.